If I could live my life again, there's three choices I would not change. One, I'd still marry the same gal. Two, I'd still join the Army. And three, I'd still come to Lakeview.
No matter what happens to me, physically and health-wise, there's a place for me here to rehabilitate and recuperate. And that's very mind-easing to know that.
I like the whole campus. I like the walking areas that we have and the security that's here on Lakeview.
I found that most of the good places that I visited and had a meal there and met people, that they really weren't big enough I would not have found there what I found here.
Simplicity living. For a person, when you get older, it's easy living. I won't be thinking, well, I got to do something with that dead tree, or the pond needs cleaned, or I didn't want to mess with that any longer.
I was shown an apartment on the 5th floor facing the lake that's behind me, and that did it. That was the end of the decision in that respect.
When I came, I was 75 because my husband was older. And I thought, I don't know. I'm too young. And I was comfortable like the first month.
Well, I thought it was a little early for us to come here. Back about 6 months, I realized, no, you need to come to Lakeview as quick as you can because there's so much stuff to do here. There's more things to do here than you've got time to do.
And art, music, writing, poetry and prose, card-playing clubs, exercise groups. There's a swimming pool for people who like to do that kind of thing.
And I know that we often say, almost every day, isn't it great that we're here and that we are together here?
I always, when I walk around, it's like it has that small town feel to it, like my hometown where I was born. And I love that feeling.
Well, hello there, and welcome to this special event brought to you by Lakeview Village Retirement Community. My name is Melissa Smith, and I am so honored to be the facilitator of this special event that's being presented to you today. And we thank so many of you for attending this. There's going to be some great information coming your way, and we know that this information is really important to you because the folks at Lakeview Village tell me they get questions all the time, trying to understand the different types of communities and trying to understand the finances around that. So our goal is to make sense of all of that today, and that's what it's all about. So Brad Breeding, well, he spent a robust career, really coaching retirees on their finances, and then through all of that, he became super educated on the differences between a life care community, which is what Lakeview Village is, an entrance fee community, and a rental community. So he'll help us sort through that today. With his financial knowledge and senior care expertise, Brad has spoken at numerous conferences and retirement communities really all across the country, sharing his insights and helping hundreds, probably more like thousands of seniors navigate this really important decision. In fact, Brad even wrote a book about it. What's the deal with retirement communities? So Brad, thank you so much for being with us today and helping to educate us.
Well, thank you for having me. I always enjoy doing this, and definitely a lot of questions out there, a lot of information that is necessary, so I'm glad to be a part of that.
Well, we appreciate it. And speaking of questions, we want to tell attendees how to ask those questions today because we anticipate plenty. So you're looking at this screen right now that says ask a question. If you scroll on your computer on this page that you're on, you're going to see a form down there. Throw in your name, throw in your question, make sure you hit submit or it won't come to us. And then that way we will collect those throughout Brad's presentation, and we promise to get those questions answered for you at the end of the presentation. If you by chance have a question for Lakeview Village, at that time we will have Lynn Tenbrink from Lakeview Village join us as well so that we make sure and get all of those questions answered. So, Brad, I believe it's time for me to hand this thing over to you. Take it away.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Melissa. And welcome to all of you that are on the call today. It's a pleasure to spend a little bit of time with you here this afternoon. So, choosing a retirement community, make your first choice the right choice. So, a few things before we jump into the content here today. First of all, just let me say that nothing I talk with you about today should be considered investment or financial advice. Now, we're not here to talk about investments or anything like that, but we are talking about planning, and finances is, a big part of this decision. And so we talk about some of that. So just know that it's not, you need to talk to your own financial professionals. And also, this is not a solicitation or recommendation of any type of retirement community or any particular retirement community, I should say. I really try to be as objective as I can with these. I will say this, I think that communities like Lakeview Village can be a really good solution for a lot of people. I say that because I've seen firsthand what it has meant to so many people in the many communities that I've visited across the country. But I also recognize that you are all in your own unique situation, your own set of circumstances, and you have to ultimately find that what's best for you, whatever that ends up being. So what I'm going to cover with you today, first we'll talk about some of the top concerns among older adults, because this is a really good place to start. I think it's a good foundation for really what we're talking about, which is planning. What do we need to plan for and kind of try to protect ourselves against, if you will. We'll talk about taking a little wider view of retirement planning. When you hear the phrase retirement planning, usually people think of money, but I try to encourage people to think more broadly than just that. And so we'll look at kind of what I'm talking about there. And then senior living options. There are so many different options. There's so much confusion out there, different nuances and so forth. So I want to help kind of break that down a little bit for you, hopefully bring some clarity to that. And then we'll dig in a little bit further. And we're going to focus more specifically on a particular type of retirement community, which here it says CCRCs. There's a lot of terminology in the industry, but CCRCs are life plan communities, life care. I'll break all that down for you. But anyway, we're going to dig a little deeper into that type of model. And then finally, when to make the move. This is a question that I get a lot. When's the best time to make the move? And so I'll just touch on that for you a little bit as well. So one of my favorite quotes comes from a popular 20th century philosopher, Yogi Berra, who once said, if you don't know where you're going, you'll end up someplace else. And I love this quote because, number one, like most of the things he said, it is kind of funny, but also it's really true in some ways. What we're talking about today is planning for your best future. And if you don't have some sense of what that looks like and what's important to you and where you want to go, then you could, of course, end up anywhere. So I love to start with that. And now, I also want to kind of put a question before you. What does peace of mind, or what is peace of mind for you? If you were to really stop and think about that, and maybe you already have, but if you sat down for 5 or 10 minutes later today and you really just shut your eyes and you think about what does peace of mind mean for me at this point in my life? What does that mean for me right now? And what does it mean for me in the future? What do I want to see in my future? What do I not want to see? What do I want to avoid? What brings you peace of mind as you think about those things? That, to me, is a really important first step. Because it's kind of like I said before, if you don't know where you're going and what's important or not important, then it's hard to plan. So keep this in mind as we go through this next slide. So I'm going to share with you in just a moment the results of a survey this was done several years ago by Merrill Lynch and a group called AgeWave. And I suspect the answers will be very similar today. But they asked people in retirement, I think it was 65 and older, what are the biggest concerns you have about living a long life? Now, why a long life? Well, we know that on the whole, we are living longer. Now, I'm sure some of you have seen the articles really that just have come out over the last couple of days that life expectancy has actually taken a little bit of a dip because of COVID and some other things as well. But the long-term trend, certainly we know, is longer life expectancies. And so with that, there comes some other things we have to think about. Of course, our money has to last longer. But in that survey, this is what the answers that you can see here. The number one response was serious health problems. 72% said serious health problems, and I'm sure that includes all the complexities that come along with those and the expenses. Not being a burden on family was the second most popular response. I've seen other surveys that put this at 70 or 80%. You can even see things on here like being lonely or not having a purpose. These are kind of those social wellness concerns. So when you think about what I asked you a moment ago, and what does peace of mind mean for you? In many ways, for many of you, it might mean the opposite of what you see here, meaning to the extent that you can, through planning, minimize these concerns in your life, that should effectively increase your peace of mind. So the question then is, what's the best way to do that? What's the best path forward for you to make sure that you can effectively plan for and minimize each of these concerns that you see here? And you may have other concerns that aren't on the screen. So let's talk for a moment about a retirement plan. As I said earlier, and when I say, usually to most people, this means the first thing they think about is money and finances. And that certainly is an important part of it. And, some people think about retirement planning being planning for retirement and saving for retirement. And others think of it, of course, or I like to say, you also have to think about planning through retirement, throughout your retirement. And that's really more what we're talking about today. And finances is certainly an important part. Asset allocation, your investments, your income strategies, all of those things. But there's three other categories I want to share with you that are sort of, they're all interconnected and in some ways all come back to finances in the end. So the next one is wellness. What does wellness have to do with a retirement plan, you might ask? Well, remember the number one concern on that previous slide I showed you in that survey was serious health problems. So naturally, how can we minimize the risk of those serious health problems and, of course, the expenses that come with those? Remember, I said it all kind of comes back to finances in some way. So as you think about wellness, consider that it's not just the physical. Diet and exercise obviously is very important. The social piece also may be, in some cases, just as important as the physical aspects of wellness. And when we talk about social, it's not just a matter of having a lot of people around. It's really meaningful interactions on a regular basis. And, that's really critical to our overall health, is those meaningful, almost daily interactions with people to whom that we have a relationship with, whether it's friends or family members or even just acquaintances. Emotional wellness, spiritual wellness are both very important. Vocational wellness. On that previous slide, one of the concerns was not having a sense of purpose. And so that really would fall in some ways under this vocational. And really what that is, still being able to utilize your talents, your expertise, your knowledge, your experience, no matter what stage of life you're in, still being able to use that in some way and feel valued and recognized for that. So that's a really important part of wellness. And then finally, our intellectual wellness, continuing to challenge ourselves mentally, continuing to learn new things every day. So I think it's important to really take an inventory of how well you're doing in each of these areas of your life, because all of this contributes to your overall wellness. And again, can help minimize that number one concern that we saw earlier, and the cost, sometimes exorbitant costs that can come with those. But that leads to the next one, which is your post-health event plan. Sometimes health can kind of decline gradually for folks. Sometimes maybe they live a healthy life right up until the end. And then for others, health can change very suddenly and unexpectedly. And, in that case, it can really turn everything upside down. Too many families don't plan ahead, and they wait until something happens, and so I commend you all for being on this call, because I know you're already thinking about some of this, so that's great. But the question is, what's the plan if something were to happen, particularly if it was unexpectedly or suddenly, whether it's a result of a stroke or a fall or a heart attack or some other health condition, and things change very rapidly. What's the plan? Where would you want to be in that situation? What services will you have available? Who would you want to have involved? All of these different things, trying to picture that. And you can't plan for everything, certainly, but by educating yourself and thinking through these things, you can certainly help, minimize certainly the heartache and all that comes along with that later on, not only for you, but for your family. And then finally, that leads, of course, to this last one, which is family. Remember, the second biggest concern was not being a burden on family. So, really having those important conversations and knowing whether you would want them involved or not if something changed later on. And this even gets into that, one of those other things, which was having enough money to leave to family and so forth. So again, all of these in my mind are connected in some way. But a bigger point that I always like to make is that where you live throughout your retirement years actually plays a very important role in every one of these categories, more than you may even realize. But if you think about it, say wellness, for instance, or where you live, the environment in which you live, the community around you, or the lack thereof maybe, that plays a big role in your overall wellness plan and those different categories that I showed you. If you think about your post-health event plan, again, if something changed suddenly, where you're living in that moment really dictates what that scenario, what that situation could look like. And certainly to the extent that your family, or to what extent your family would need to be involved in that type of a situation. So housing is a very important part of your overall retirement plan when you think more broadly about what a plan really is. So with that, let's talk about the two choices. I mean, really, all of you have two choices, two overarching choices. Now, there's categories under each of these, but when it comes to where you live, I mean, there's really, the first one is to stay in your own house. Many of you may still live in the same house you've lived in for years, maybe decades. Some of you, maybe you've already downsized, but in some way, shape, or form, you're still in your own residence. The other one, of course, is to move to some type of a retirement community. Now, there's categories under this, under each of these, really, as I mentioned, but the point is these are the two kind of main choices, either stay in your own home or some sort of a community setting. One time somebody did raise his hand in one of my presentations. This was in a live event that I did. And he said, "You forgot one." And when I asked him what that was, this was the answer he gave me: move in with the kids. And anytime I'm doing a live event and I share this, it gets a big laugh, and I always love seeing the reactions. But, I also put this here because there was a time in our country where this wasn't so uncommon. Maybe it wasn't moving back in with the kids necessarily, but multiple generations living under one household, under one roof. Particularly if you were to go way back, pre-industrial revolution, when it was an agricultural society. You might have 3 generations living together, 2 at least, and shared meals together, worked on the farm, whatever the case may be. And that worked quite well. But so much has changed. We're more spread out than ever before. We've distanced ourselves over the last 50 to 100 years in a big way with the highway systems and airline travel and everything else. And now, of course, you can work anywhere, but people are working in all different parts of the country, parts of the world. We have more dual income households than ever before, so more people are working. I could go on and on. People are living longer, but with more chronic health conditions. And so as a result, it's made this much more or much less practical, than it once was. And so that really is the crux of everything I'm talking about today. What it's done is that's left this gap where, so many of you have to kind of plan for yourself to figure out what's the best way for me to fill that gap. And what I mean by that, when I talk about that gap, I'm really talking about those concerns I showed you earlier. What's the best way for you to address those concerns? Because I think it's more important than ever before for you to plan for your own future. So let's talk about each of those options. And I'm going to go through this, pretty quickly because there's a lot that we could, I could probably spend hours on some of this, but just to hit on some of the highlights. Let's talk about some of the reasons people say they want to stay in their house. And by the way, I can understand these reasons, totally understandable. So the first one is that it's comfortable and familiar. There's the memories. It's a very emotional thing for some people staying in their own home. Is that emotional connection? You might say it's less expensive. And in some cases, maybe it is. In other cases, maybe not, because you have to think going forward, not just today. And there's so many variables that could ultimately determine whether staying in your own home is more expensive or less expensive. But I often tell people, even if it is less expensive, doesn't necessarily mean it's the best choice. There's a lot more that has to go into that decision process. Avoids the hassle of moving. I hear this one a lot. People just don't want to deal with all their stuff. They could be convinced for every other reason that they should probably move, but they just don't want to deal with it. They don't want to deal with all the stuff. So I always say there's, that stuff isn't going to deal with itself. Somebody's going to deal with that stuff, and it's not going to get any easier for you as time goes on. So, and a lot of communities, I'd be willing to bet Lynn and the folks at Lakewood Village probably have all kinds of resources that can help with that kind of thing. Maintains a sense of independence. This is probably the biggest one. People say by staying in my home, I can remain independent. And I've changed that. You'll notice I said sense of independence because this is always interesting to me. You really have to think, what does independence mean for you? Because I have seen many situations, and I'm sure you all have as well, where somebody stays in their home for the long term, but it's anything but an independent situation. In fact, it's a very dependent situation. But for many people, just simply by virtue of living physically in their own home, they view that as independence. And some of that's because they feel like they can still make their own decisions and so forth. So I get it, but you really have to think, what does independence look like for you now, certainly, but also, again, in the future. So let's talk about some of the other things. These are some of the possible implications. It doesn't mean all of these things would come to fruition for everyone, but some of the other aspects to consider. Certainly the ongoing maintenance of the home. I think everybody would have that one. Certainly the day-to-day things, but then replacing the HVAC or the roof or the siding and, just all the things that tend to pop up over time. Some people just really get tired of having to deal with all that it takes to maintain the home. Home modifications. I always mention this because I've seen too many people where something happens. Let's just say it's a fall, for instance. It could be any number of things. And then they have to go into rehab. And, maybe it's an extended period of time. Maybe it's more temporary. But usually it's at that point there's a discussion about, is it safe to go back home? Is the home safe, for that person to move back into? Or do you have to modify the home? Well, that's not the time to have that discussion. It's already a very high-stress event. And you don't want to have to figure that out. So I always say this is something you want to think about now. And it's more than just whether there's a bedroom upstairs or downstairs, like, stairs. Certainly whether you have to walk stairs is a big part of it. But you think about it, particularly if mobility becomes a big issue later on. Height of your cabinets, width of doorways and hallways, your bathrooms, the floor surfaces, the lighting. There's a lot that goes into that. There can be some real safety hazards. So thinking about that now and thinking about the cost of it, what it would cost if you needed to modify your home, that's an important thing to do now. Loneliness. Now, I don't want to say that by staying in your home you would automatically be lonely. That's not the case. Everybody's different. But I will say, for many people, I think the risk of social isolation is probably greater in their home because, it's just, I've seen these, so many things that I read, different studies. I think I saw one not long ago where it says the average person over the age of 70, I think it was, spends something like 6 to 8 hours a day watching TV or something. Now, that may not be all of you, but my point is, for some people, that risk of social isolation can then lead to loneliness, which can then lead to kind of depression on some level, and then that can lead to us not having the best dietary habits. So it's kind of that cascading effect. So my point here is just asking, for anybody that says, I'm going to stay in my home, I always say make sure you think about how will you maintain those important social interactions on a regular basis that I said were so important. Because it's critical to our health, particularly, again, as I said, if mobility were to change. Delaying a move. Some people say, I want to stay in my home as long as possible. And I always highlight that as long as possible, because then what happens is sometimes they end up having to move, not because they want to necessarily or because they've chosen to, but because they feel forced to, either because of their health or by family or both. And sometimes that can be a difficult thing. Nobody wants to feel like they have to move, and it can become a very defensive sort of posture for some people. As I said, not everyone. We all handle things differently, but these are all just things to think about. In-home care. I can stay in my own home and hire care if something changes. You certainly can. There's some wonderful, I have a couple of friends that have caregiver agencies, so that's great. But I will say there are some real challenges in that industry right now, just a lot of turnover, staff shortages. So sometimes it's not finding a caregiver, it's finding and keeping one. And consistency is a big problem because, unfortunately, it's sad reality, but for some people that caregiver may be one of the only people they see over the course of a week. And so when you have really high turnover, 60% turnover in that industry, you have different people coming and it's different routines, and that can get frustrating. And you're still usually going to have a family member involved at a high level, even with an in-home caregiver. Somebody's got to oversee that process, be involved, make sure everything's getting done right, and so forth. And that leads to the last one, potential burden on family, which, as we saw earlier, is a big concern for many people. So I always say that staying in your own home probably requires as much planning, if not more planning, than moving to a retirement community. Because there's just so many variables like this, so many unknowns that you have to think about now in order to really avoid those headaches and heartaches later on. Okay, so now that we've talked a little bit about kind of the pros and cons of staying in your own home, let's talk about some of the other options. And this is where, as I said, a lot of confusion comes in. And that's the different types of retirement communities. So let's kind of start high level first. I'm going to show you in a moment some of these different categories. But first, look at the bottom of the screen. So on the far left side over here, it says no help needed, meaning, let's just call this, again, people have different ways of defining independence, but let's just say this is true independence. You don't need any type of care or help on a daily basis. Over here is the complete opposite, 24-hour care. That represents the two ends of the continuum, right? The two extremes of that continuum. So that would be like 24-hour nursing care, skilled nursing care. And then, of course, we have different things in between, assisted living, personal care, maybe memory care somewhere in there, those kind of things. So as you look at this, let's talk about the different types of community. Now, as I said, there's so much terminology. I often tell people not to even pay much attention to the terminology because, like this one, for instance, active adult, you see that used for all types of places nowadays. But I I have to call it something. So let's just say this is what I would refer to as an active adult neighborhood. So this is really nothing more. This type of community, you'll notice, focuses heavily on this side, but not over here, right? So these are just 55 and older planned developments, neighborhoods. You, in many cases, still own the home, but you pay HOA dues. All the exterior maintenance may be taken care of. You still handle interior maintenance. Maybe there's a clubhouse and a pool or a golf course or what have you. But, again, there's no care provided by that community. So in many ways, it's still like living in your own home. So that's the first category of senior living communities that are out there. The next one is called a rental retirement community. Sometimes they're called independent with services or independent plus. These are apartment-style retirement communities, 55 and older, sometimes 62 and older, depending. But apartment-style rental communities. And you'll notice they stretch a little further out on this continuum, meaning that they might provide some form of assisted living, maybe memory care. Sometimes those services may be delivered in your apartment through a caregiving agency that they've contracted with or something like that. Or in some cases, they may have separately licensed assisted living residences there within the community. So that can be a little bit different. And that's one of those things you just have to research or look into as you're doing your research. But that's a rental retirement community. The next two, I'll kind of lump in here together. These are what I would call standalone care providers, assisted living facilities or nursing facilities. They don't focus on the independent side at all. Residents in each of these two types of communities are receiving some form of care, whether it's just a little bit of help on a daily basis or, again, whether it's 24-hour care. So these really aren't retirement communities per se. They're really more assisted or care facilities. And then finally, we have this last category, which used to be referred to as a continuing care retirement community or a CCRC. Now it's more often referred to as a life plan community. And then even within this, there's some different types that I'll get into in just a moment. But this particular type, this is Lakeview Village falls in this category. And you'll see where it's essentially some combination of all these previous types that I've shown you on this chart. So residents move in while they're independent, maybe still very active, but they have all those services across the complete continuum available to them as needed. So I want to spend the next few minutes on this one, this last one. So these next few slides will be tied mostly to this last type because since it does cover all these previous types, there is a little more complexity that goes into it. So I want to help you understand that a little bit better. So first, most life plan communities require an entry fee. Now, I won't spend a lot of time on why that is, but let me just give you a quick evolution of kind of the history. Way back when, this model, this idea of basically housing and health care for your life started well over 100 years ago. And back then, it was usually a church-based organization looking after widows. And what they would do is they would say, we're going to provide your housing and health care for you for life. But back then, the way it worked is that person would have to assign all of their assets to the church. Now, sometimes they may not have had much in assets, so there was a very charitable component to it. But whatever they had was assigned to the church, and then the church would essentially provide housing and health care needs for that person for their life. Well, that didn't work out well in some cases. There just wasn't enough money to fulfill that obligation. And as people their wealth started to grow with the Industrial Revolution, they didn't necessarily want to assign their wealth over to an organization any longer. So the entry fee model evolved out of that. And so today what we have is basically a few different types of options. Now, one that you'll find many times works kind of like this, okay? Now, this is conceptual. You'll notice I don't even have dollar amounts on here and all of this. You need to do your research about each individual community. But conceptually, a lot of times the entry fee works like this. You'll pay that entry fee in the year you move in, and the amount can vary, certainly depending on the community, but also even on, say, the size of the floor plan and other things. But whatever that entry fee is, it will be refundable in many cases on a declining basis. Now, this example goes out 3 years. You might find some that go out 2 years or some that go out 4 or 5 years. But the point is, some portion of this entry fee will be refundable to you on a declining basis if you move out or in the event of death. So, during year one, maybe 75% is refundable, then maybe 50%, 25%, so forth. So, this is an option that is offered many times. Lakeview Village, I know, offers this option, and it's a traditional entry fee contract. Now, you'll also find some retirement communities, and again, we're talking about that last one that I showed you that covers that full continuum from independent to 24-hour care, everything in between, entry fee model. Some other ones may look like this, where let's just say all other things being equal. All right, if everything else was the same, and it's not always, but all other things being equal, you would pay more for your entry fee. However, in this example, you would always get back 50%. There are other ones that may look more like this, where you pay even more but get back 90%. So, some communities will offer options. I know Lakeview Village, I think, offers a traditional and a 75% possibly. So Lynn and her team can tell you more about that. But I'm just giving you a conceptual overview so you can see how this works and kind of these trade-offs here that are really important to understand. So it's good that, you have options out there. But as I said, you need to do your own research, understand the contract stipulations. One of the things Lynn told me before our call that I really liked is that their contract actually states that refunds are due within 6 months. Now, they're often paid within 30 days, she told me. But, they have a max time frame on which they have to have this paid out to people when they move out or in the event of death. Some don't have that. They can just be unlimited. And so, again, just understanding the contract stipulations around this is important. But conceptually, this is how it works. Now I want to talk to you about what happens on a month-to-month basis with your monthly fees that cover the services and everything that you're receiving on a daily basis. So there are different models for how this works. And what we're really talking about here is what happens to your monthly service fee if you should need care later on. That's really what we're talking about. So if you see right here, independent living, assisted living, nursing care. The first model that's out there is called life care. And this is what Lakeview Village offers. And it's a true life care contract. And what that means is that essentially what you're paying on a monthly basis doesn't change if you need care. Okay, now that may not be, there may be some ancillary charges, or maybe you have to pay more for meals when you move into assisted living because you're no longer buying your own groceries, things like that. But the point is you don't pay more for care when you need it. So it really gives you predictability. People that really like predictability, here's another way to look at it. It really puts a cap on your cost exposure for care expenses that you may need later on. So for people that like to know pretty much what their monthly cost is going to be no matter how long they live or how much care they need, life care is really good because it gives you that predictability, and it makes planning a little bit easier because you know what the bulk of your monthly cost is always going to be. So that's one of the options that you'll find out there in the marketplace. And this is really nice when you have a couple. If there's two people, you kind of get double the benefit because you just, again, I don't have a lot of time to get into all the details, but just know that the benefit of life care is even magnified in the case of a couple. Now, having said that, there are some other options that are out there. Some communities may offer something like this, where when you're living independently, you would pay less, but if you need care, you pay the full cost for it at that time, as you can see here. And as you know, costs can be really expensive, $10,000, $12,000 a month or more in some cases. And, of course, we also don't know how long we'll need care. But some people say, well, that's okay. I'll pay more, but I'll pay it, when I need it and that kind of thing. So you have these different trade-offs. Some communities offer kind of a hybrid between these two. You don't see that as much anymore. And then finally, there are some rental contracts out there. But a couple of things to understand. If it's a true life plan community, meaning it covers all of these different levels like I showed you earlier, if there's no entry fee, then your monthly fee, even while living independently, is going to have to be more because they're collecting it as you go. They're not getting any up front. So they're collecting it as you go. So your monthly is going to be a lot more. We have a couple of rental life plan communities where I live in North Carolina. And comparatively to some of the other communities, their monthly rates are much higher. And that's because there's no entry fee. So you just need to know that. And then, of course, you'd still pay the full cost for care if you ever need it. And there can be some other things that are a little different about rental contracts. Sometimes they may not even provide this last level here. So all of this, as I said, you need to do your own research. But you can see here how the different models work. And so, again, it's nice to have choices with your options. Okay, so let's talk about a few of the other aspects of life plan communities like Lakeview Village. First, they're going to look at your health and your finances. Why? So it's kind of like an underwriting process. So at some point, if you start to get serious about moving in, most communities like that are going to look at these two things. They're going to look at your health and your finances, particularly if it's a life care contract, which is the kind I showed you a moment ago where your monthly cost doesn't change. Well, in order to make that work, the organization, that community needs some sense that people who are moving in are not in immediate risk of needing health care or of running out of money. Because if everybody that moved in ran out of money or needed care, in the short run, it makes it really hard to maintain that model because they're taking some of the risk of that cost of care. So they're going to do a little bit of underwriting on the front end for that reason. Having said that, most also provide financial support. This is a big part of what makes these types of communities like Lakeview Village attractive because if you do exhaust your assets, if you live longer than the averages or need more care or whatever it may be and you exhaust your assets, most of these life plan communities, like I've shown you here, life care communities will keep you there. They'll pick up the difference. So that's important. That doesn't happen often because of this evaluation that they do on the front end, but it can happen, and people like knowing it's there if necessary. And then finally, just know that some portion of your entry fee and some portion of your ongoing monthly fees may be deductible as a prepaid medical expense. Anywhere from, I've seen 20, 30, 40% of your entry fee and or your monthly fee may be deductible as a prepaid medical expense. So, basically, there's a formula. So residents get a letter every January that says, okay, based on our budget and overall healthcare expenditures relative to our total population, here's the formula. Take it to your accountant. And you have to you have to itemize. If you take the standard deduction, then obviously things like this aren't, you can't take these types of deductions. But if you itemize, then maybe your accountant shows you that it does make sense to itemize after you move in just because of these deductions. You would have to talk with your accountant about that. But just know that those are available, and they do make a difference for people that take those deductions when you look at your budget and so forth. So one of the questions that I get a lot is, when's the best time to make the move? And there's no perfect way for me to answer this question. We did a blog post just a few weeks ago on how different people age at different paces or different rates. And I've seen 85-year-olds that are more active than some 65-year-olds and so forth. And so certainly, to say there's a perfect age is hard to do. But here's what I tell people a lot of times, and I'm going to share a quote with you in a moment to sort of illustrate this. But really you have to think about it in terms of where you are, I think emotionally and mentally, and also thinking about the future. So just to kind of sort of a segue into where I want to go with this, I want to share this quote. This is a gentleman that moved into a life care community up in Connecticut, and he stays in touch with me, and this is what he wrote not long after that. Mostly the opportunity to live in community is lost to us here in the West, meaning the western part of the world. There is, I believe, a deep yearning for its return. I have found community. These residents, early friends, are my new family with whom I shall go through the rest of my life. So, I mentioned earlier the importance of social to our overall wellness. And I even talked about how there was a point in time when here in our country, multiple generations lived together. And that was important too. And we've gotten away from that. And so now, I think that's really what he's alluding to, is that sense of community. And so when you think about a community, a retirement community, and I've seen many beautiful communities with amazing amenities and services and all this, but at the end of the day, what makes the community is the people, right? It's the community of people. And those relationships are so meaningful to people. As I go around and I talk to different residents at different communities, and I know Lynn can tell you about this, I'm sure, because she sees it every day, but it's those friendships within the community that are so important to people, not just now, but also because they say, as I age, if I need care later, I've got people here, that I know, familiar faces around who can be right here by my side and kind of walk that journey with me. And that is important. But the point to all of this is it takes time to develop relationships and friendships. It doesn't happen overnight. And it's once you do that you really, I have found that people really start to appreciate living in that community. So you want to do that soon enough, move in soon enough that you can really let those sort of relationships begin to take hold, and then you can really get all the benefits that come out of those relationships on a daily basis. And if you contrast that to, say, a situation where, for whatever reason, you all of a sudden have to move into an assisted living facility or something like that, and you don't know anybody, and it's a new situation. It's already a highly stressful situation because of your health. Maybe you feel forced to go there. You can see the difference between those two scenarios. And so that may not happen in every case, but that, I think, is the important thing. So you have to ask, at what point do I want to be somewhere where I can start to enjoy those types of relationships and benefit from it and everything else? And is that important to me in my future as well? So I hope that helps you to just at least think a little bit about when the best time is for you to make the move. So with that, I want to thank you all. I think I've used up, looks like about 45 minutes exactly. So we did good. Thank you all for your time, and I guess I'll turn it back over now. Melissa, we want to do a Q&A, I think, right?
Absolutely, we sure do. That was a lot of great information. In fact, while you continue to take another drink there and kind of take a breath, Brad, I know you've had a lot to say here over the last 45 minutes. I want to bring Lynn Tenbrink, who is the Sales and Marketing Director at Lakeview Village, because I want to keep you close by. Lynn, some of the questions that are coming in, I think, are going to be ones that we will need your help with as well. And again, if you joined a little late, there's a form that's right below this square that we're sitting in, and right there on the screen is a form. You fill it out, put in your name, your question, and make sure you hit submit so that comes straight to us, and we will get your questions answered. So I'm going to kick it off with this first question, Brad, that deals with contracts. And this question is from Rachel, and she says, please tell us what we should know about refund policies on refundable contracts. So maybe we might need a little context around that and help us with that,
Sure.
Okay?
Sure, yeah. So when it comes to entry fee refunds, and again, there can be different forms, as I showed you earlier, but whichever form it is, when it comes to the refundable piece, that refund can be paid in different ways. So different communities approach that differently. A lot of communities will say, we're going to pay the refund once your residence is reoccupied. And some people, and I don't have a huge problem with that as long as it's understood on the front end and that it's very clearly stated in the contract. Because after all, if I'm selling my home, I don't get my money until my home sells, right? So I kind of look at it that way. And again, as long as I understand all that on the front end, that's okay. However, some people will say, well, yeah, but what if it takes 2 years to resell that residence, and certainly that could be a possibility in some case, or, it could happen. So, for that reason, I think it's nice. Sometimes, communities will put a time limit on that if it hasn't resold within X amount of time, we're going to pay your refund regardless. And that's what I mentioned earlier. I know Lynn told me before the call that they have a 6-month maximum, which I think is really reasonable. I've seen some 2-year maximums in contracts, and even that I think is okay. At least there's a maximum there, and that within that period of time. But 6 months I think is really great. But also, she said that their history has been to pay it much, much sooner than that, within 30 days. But that's just kind of the maximum they put in the contract.
Awesome. Hi, Lynn. I didn't even say hi to you. How are you today?
I'm great.
Good. This next question, and I have another question around contracts and all in just a second, Brad, but this next question might be for you, Lynn. It's from Tiffany, and she is asking, does Parkinson's disqualify you for life care? And maybe Brad's got insight on that too. I don't know.
Well, I would say we don't typically just automatically say somebody is disqualified from life care, especially with medical treatments, medications that we have for so many diagnoses now. But what we can do for people, if they do feel like that they do have a diagnosis that would disqualify them, we could go ahead and do their health assessment without getting the full application and getting the entry fee, getting the deposit. Sometimes if they have a clear concern, we'll go ahead and do that health assessment without going through the entire process. Basically, I mean, as a courtesy, if that's what they share with us up front.
Okay. Any other additional thoughts, Brad, or maybe that's out of your wheelhouse?
Well, it's a little out of my wheelhouse because I just don't deal with it on a day-to-day basis. So Lynn's probably a better resource for that question.
Well, I would agree. I just didn't want to cut you off if you had some thought there. This next question, it's something that actually, Lynn, I think came up in our last virtual event that we did, and it's about equalization. There's this term equalization, and it says, can you tell us what equalization means in higher levels of care if you have a life care contract? So again, we probably need to give a little context around that. Lynn? Or Brad, either one. I don't know who's the best person to talk about that.
Brad, can you take that?
Yeah, I'm happy to. I assume
we don't have equalization, so
okay.
I think that coming from outside of Lakeview would.
That makes sense. Yeah.
Yeah. So when you hear equalization, I talked about life care earlier, and life care, of course, is what Lakeview Village offers, and that again means your monthly rate stays the same, okay? And when I say stays the same, that doesn't mean there can't be inflationary increases. That's true of any retirement community, any type of contract. But you're not going to pay more for care. So whatever you're paying, that's what you continue paying. Some communities are offering an equalized contract, and what that basically means is that they just set a predetermined rate for health care, okay, which is a discounted rate. So, and then everybody pays that. So what they might do is they say, we're going to take the middle, whatever the median cost of independent living home is, and whatever that cost is, that's what everybody will pay. So some people will pay more if they're in a lower cost residence. Some people pay less if they're in a higher cost resident. That's what equalized rate is. And the benefit of that kind of depends on where somebody's living previously. So it applies to both residents. So sometimes people call it double equalized rates, but meaning resident 1 needs care and they have to pay more for it, and resident 2 later on needs care, now they have to pay more for it. But somebody's at a higher cost unit, maybe it doesn't work. Maybe it works better. So it all comes back to the fact that there's different options out there. And that one's a little harder to explain sometimes, but it just basically means everybody's going to pay the same thing.
Everybody within that community is going to pay
within that community, yes.
Okay. Okay. And is that like when you showed that chart, is equalization, does it then, it sounds like, does it typically go up then depending upon the level of care? That everybody's bearing the burden?
Yeah, well, just look at it this way. Let's say when you think about independent living, if you forget about care for a moment, just folks that are living independently on their own in an apartment or a villa or whatever it may be.
Okay.
Some may be in a 2 or 3 bedroom, villa, and others may be in a 1 bedroom, apartment.
Yeah.
So somebody living in a 1 bedroom apartment is going to be paying less than somebody in the 3 bedrooms. Well, the cost of care, if they need care, may be somewhere in the middle of those two. You follow what I'm saying? So the person that was in a really expensive unit may actually pay less. The person that was in a less expensive unit will pay more when they need care. They kind of meet in the middle. Does that make sense?
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think a lot of the real message here is, and this could be the right plan for somebody, but make sure you understand it. Make sure you do. And as we can just see from this conversation, it can be a little bit difficult to understand. And even a life care contract can be difficult to understand. It takes a lot of discussion. So our goal is to educate people, and we want you to make the right decision for you, but we want you to make it with all of the information and understanding all of your options and then making the right decision for you.
So, Lynn, what I kind of hear both of you saying is that the term life care doesn't equal the same thing at every CCRC. Is that correct?
Yeah.
Yeah, that is correct. So what you'll find a lot of times is that the contract like Lakeview Village offers, a lot of people within the industry will call that a true life care contract. If you hear somebody say it's true life care, that means your monthly rate just stays the same. And the reason they made that you hear true life care is because now they have these equalized rate contracts, which work a little bit differently. So you have true life care versus equalized rate life care.
Okay.
And I think something to think about on the equalized contracts as well is the people who are paying less, they were probably paying that lesser amount because it's what they could afford. And then when they go to higher levels of care, they're the ones getting the increase. So they maybe put that in their budget for a reason. So you have to think about that. What's your budget going to be when you go to higher levels of care? Are you going to be able to afford that increase?
Yeah, that's a good point. You have to play out all the scenarios before you sign the contract for sure. Okay, Mary Ann has a question. Does Lakeview have a declining refund policy? What if 10 or 15 years go by? Is it still 75%? I think that's for you, Lynn.
So if you have the 75% refundable contract, it is 75% refundable from day one. And it doesn't decline over the years.
Okay.
That will be 75% refundable from day one.
Wow. Okay. Tim has this question. Do you require any personal financial statements, for example, balance sheet and funding, pension plans, annuities, etc.? I'm assuming when you're signing a contract or when, working through things for a contract at Lakeview. Lynn.
And I'm sorry, I missed the beginning of it.
Do you require any personal financial statements, like a balance sheet and funding, pension plans, annuities? So maybe give us an idea as to what kind of, personal statements you all look for.
Basically everything that you just mentioned. So what we want to see, and like Brad said, we're going to do a health assessment and we're going to do a financial assessment. And so in that financial assessment, we need to know your income and your assets. And, we maybe don't need to know everything. We need to know that you can afford the home that you're choosing. So that may not mean that you disclose every bit of your financial background to us. If half of your finances shows you can afford to live at Lakeview, then that's all we need to see. And then we just need the documentation to back that up. So your tax returns, and then, statements from your investments.
Got it. Marcia has a really good question.
That's what.
I'm sorry?
And that's going to be very standard. That's what any entry fee community is going to ask for.
Perfect. Marcia wants to know, how would our long-term care insurance be affected or be utilized, I guess? Lynn, and maybe Brad.
Either one? You want me to take that? Or
I'll let Brad comment first.
Okay.
I kind of like that. Part of this is because I like them hearing from Brad that it's this unbiased answer.
Sure.
It doesn't have to do with how one community works over another. And then I'm certainly glad to fill in with Lakeview.
You got it.
Yeah. Well, and what I may do is go back to. All right. So let's start here. So this is again what a life care contract looks like. So no matter where you are, you can see that same monthly cost. Now, some people will say, well, do I still need long-term care insurance if I'm in a life care community? Because it's kind of like I'm doubling up. This kind of works like a long-term care insurance. And I always say, number one, I would never recommend somebody drop their long-term care insurance because things can change. I mean, what if you move into the community and something totally unforeseen happens and you need to move out for some reason? Well, now you don't have your long-term care insurance and you don't have the life care any longer. There's other reasons, like you may want to, let's just say you want to hire somebody on your own to come in to your independent living apartment or something. You may want to have your coverage. So there's different reasons that I would recommend against totally dropping it. But the other thing is that while it may be viewed as doubling up, it also, the benefit doubles up. Because if you think about this for a moment, if you go from independent to assisted, for example, you're still paying the same monthly cost. But let's say now all of a sudden you can qualify for a claim on your long-term care insurance. Your monthly cost is the same, but now you can take a claim on your long-term care, and that's going to lower the net cost here in assisted living, right? Let's just say it cuts this in half maybe or whatever it is, depending on how much coverage you have. So now you're paying less when getting care than you were paying when you were living independently because of your long-term care insurance. So, it can work quite well in that case, with life care.
That's exactly how we explained it, that it actually works quite well together. Other reasons to not cancel is probably you've been paying into that policy for a long time. So don't just then, at the end, give up what you already paid into. And people bought long-term care insurance to protect their assets, or if they didn't have enough assets. So that's still the case, even if you're at a life plan community. And it's just like Brad just said, what's going to happen is you're just going to have less out-of-pocket expense, which is still going to protect your assets could be other things. It could be to maybe, go into a larger apartment. If we don't know whatever your limits are on your long-term care insurance, maybe you can have a quite large apartment in assisted living, or you can still have some private caregivers. There's some other benefits that you could get for protecting your monthly income still.
This next question from Elaine, and Elaine, we have a slight delay, so I think you were asking in reference to refunds when we were talking about refunds just a minute ago, Brad and Lynn. And so Elaine's question is, what happens when one person of a couple passes away and the other person is still there? Does that make a difference in terms of how the contracts work and the refunds?
You want me to take that one, Lynn?
I will just say that's going to be in each community's contract. Typically, what I've seen is that both people, the couple, the spouse also has to pass away or leave the community. So the way it's worded is when neither of the couples still live at the community.
Yeah, that's I would agree that's mostly what I've seen. When it comes to the entry fee refund, it's usually paid at the second. Another way to look at it is paid once that unit's no longer occupied, or once there's no longer any occupants there.
Mm-hmm. That makes total sense. Laura Bauer has a question around capital gains tax from selling your home. She asks, do any retirement community options offset a capital gains tax from selling your house?
That's a great question. I love the way you're thinking. And so, well, first, you probably already know this, but there's a pretty sizable exclusion on selling your home before that capital gain tax kicks in. But assuming you're over that and you have the capital gain tax, there is, I mentioned earlier that there is a potentially a pretty sizable deduction on your entry fee in that first year. And that's essentially because a life care contract, if you think about it, some portion of that entry fee is essentially going into kind of a big reserve, to offset the cost of care later. And so it's that portion that can be deducted as a medical expense tax deduction. So you could effectively have that deduction, but it wouldn't necessarily offset all of your capital gain on your home, because one is an ordinary income tax deduction and the other is capital gain. So I would go talk with your advisor or accountant about that, because I think it can offset to some degree, but I don't think it would offset 100%. So I would look into that a little bit more, but just know that's probably where I would start in terms of looking at something like that.
And okay. I would just add that I agree with Brad. Some people think if they make any money on their home, they're going to pay capital gains, and it really is a sizable amount before capital gains kicks in. But of course, there are people who do make that kind of profit on their home. And the other thing I just want to add there is that is actually what our topic is going to be next month, is tax deductions for life plan communities. So we can't obviously give anybody any individual advice, but we'll just tell you how where the numbers come from to give you the tax deduction and the information that you can take to your tax advisor and how it may benefit you individually.
Yeah, that's great. That's coming up in August, and I'm scrambling for the date in my head, Lynn, but everybody will be getting an email about that soon, and we'll let them know when they can put that on their calendar, because, that will be another great topic for sure.
It'll be on the 24th and the 26th. So that one twice.
That's right, 24th and 26th. Thank you. I appreciate that. I couldn't pull it up. Here's a question from Clarissa. She's wanting to know, can someone speak to care and finances for couples who may develop different care needs? So, independent living, we all go in at the same level, and then all of a sudden the wife develops Alzheimer's and has a different care level, of need for care level.
Yeah, well, that's where I mentioned earlier that life care can really, the benefit of this particular model is magnified in the case of a couple. Because what generally happens is that if you have a couple that moves into a community with a life care contract, they're going to pay, when they're living independently over here, they're going to pay the double occupancy rate for that home or that apartment or whatever it is. So you'll have a double occupancy rate. If one of them needs care, they still continue just paying that double occupancy rate. It doesn't change. And so, as one spouse goes into assisted living, they're still paying the same double occupancy rate. One spouse goes here, they're still paying and then even if the second spouse eventually moves in here and needs care, they're still just paying that same double occupancy rate. And so that's why I said it really is magnified when you have two, because if you think about this next type, and by the way, I've done presentations just like this for this type of community too. So as Lynn said, this is a fact. It's just a fact. So with this type, if let's say you have a couple, they're over here, they're paying the double occupancy rate. All other things, apples to apple, that rate may be lower. But now one spouse needs care, they're going to pay the full cost of that care. And now let's say the second spouse later on needs care, they're going to move in and they're going to pay the full cost of this care too. So what happens is you're still paying an independent living rate over here, and then also adding the cost of care for that spouse that needs that care. So, that's where I said the benefits are really almost double for a life care contract.
And if you want to put that back up, I'm sorry, Brad, with the fee for service, if you look all the way over to the right with the nursing and healthcare monthly fee, if both the couple are both in there, And like you said earlier, paying $10,000 a month,
Yeah,
that's a lot of money.
it absolutely is. And I'm cognizant of time here. I do have a couple of other questions. I'm going to at least get to one more here before we have to go. But this one comes from Edward, and it says, how does moving within the community, like from a villa to an apartment, affect changes in the upfront and monthly fees? So it's not necessarily a care level change, but perhaps it is a villa with two folks, one passes away and somebody's like, yeah, I don't want all this house anymore. How does that work, Lynn?
Well, that's really going to be looked at on a case-by-case basis. I would say it doesn't happen a lot. Number one, there's have to be reasons for it, typically healthcare reasons or mobility reasons, a change in financial status, which can happen if you have a spouse that passes away and they have a higher income. Sometimes we can see a difference in their financial status. So what we do at Lakeview Village, our CEO and CFO, just they look at the reasons why. Somebody says, I want to move and here's why. And of course, we want to do what's best for the resident. But I would say that doesn't happen very often. But you do see it happen. You do see it happen occasionally. Maybe 3 or 4 times a year. And they do, have to look at. All of this is based on actuarial information. So when people start moving around and we lower their monthly fee, that affects the long-term business because our rates are based on here's all the places we have to live, here's how much they cost. So if we just keep lowering people's monthly fees, then that affects the bottom line. But I would say most, usually it is maybe they're in a 3,000 square foot villa and somebody really has mobility issues and they want to move to an apartment where they can get to the amenities more quickly or they're not trying to manage as much space. We certainly want to accommodate that, and we want them to stay in an independent setting. We don't want we don't want them to have a fall when they have mobility issues, and then they're no longer independent. So we're certainly going to take into account what's best for the resident, and I think that's what most communities would do as well.
Well, and I would just add very quickly that what you mentioned that it's an actuarial, it affects the finances of the organization. The reason that's important is because ultimately that protects the residents as well. Because if the organization is not properly managing their finances, then that puts in jeopardy the entire community and the residents and everything that they're relying on and this life care and everything else. So it is extremely important that these communities are well managed financially. So I actually love hearing Lynn say that because that's really important because that ultimately helps. That's to the benefit of the residents.
Right. We have to be fiscally responsible for our residents. People live here for 20 and 30 years, and we have to be here in 20 and 30 years to provide their care and to provide it at the price we said we were going to. Yeah. It's the price that we have to.
Right.
So an organization's financial rating and financial stability is very important to consider.
It's huge. I love, Lynn, when you talk about the fact that Lakeview Village is a nonprofit organization because a lot of people are confused about that. And in your case, you do the pitch, you say the words, but it's really valuable that that's the case for Lakeview Village.
It is. So being a nonprofit organization, we feel that is important because all of our money goes back into the community. We're not paying dividends. We're not paying shareholders. We're not paying owners groups. We're not paying management groups. Everything at Lakeview is at Lakeview. Our leadership is here. Our C-level's here on campus. Our board of directors is all from Kansas City. They're all local. So when they're making decisions about Lakeview, they're seeing these people every day, and it's in our same market. They know our community. But it's the dividends and the shareholders, and the places that are privately owned, they can get money from their dividends and shareholders as well. But we feel that putting our money back into the community and for our residents year after year is important to people.
Awesome. Brad, Breeding, is there any parting thoughts you want to share before we let you go today? We loved all this good knowledge.
Well, I don't know about parting thoughts, but I thought the questions were really good. So I can tell this is a really good, educated audience thinking about the right things and asking the right questions. So that's very refreshing.
Well, Brad, we thank you so much for being with us today. Lynn, hang tight for 1 second.
Thank you, Brad. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. This was really very special and great information. And what's the name of your book again, Brad?
Thank you. Yes. What's the deal with retirement communities?
Perfect. And then next month, Lynn, as you mentioned, thank you for handling that pitch for me, the tax deduction virtual event that we'll be focusing on to help folks understand how all of this plays into their taxes. And that will be on the morning of August 24th, or they can participate on the afternoon of August 26th as well. And again, they'll be getting information about that in their email boxes. Lynn, any other thoughts you wanted to share, Lynn, before we go?
I just want to tell people, just like Brad said, just being at this event, joining us today, and researching is showing great responsibility, taking control of your future. So when you're first hearing about it, it can seem overwhelming. We meet with people. I mean, sometimes for weeks, for years before they move in. This is a lot to learn about, take in, what's best for you. You're getting financial advice, you're getting tax advice. So this isn't something where you're just going to drive by on a Tuesday and see if you want to live here. This is, it's a lot to learn about, and there's some research and some time to put into it.
Absolutely, and I know you are there to answer questions. We want to put that contact information right up here on the screen so folks have that firsthand. It's the same number we've shown many times, but that's important for folks if their question did not get answered today. If any of them come in delayed, we promise to get those in Lynn's hand, and Lynn and her team will get back with you just as soon as possible to get those answered. So thanks again, everybody. Glad you stayed inside with us on this hot day in Kansas City. And we'll see you next month for the next virtual event. Thanks again, Brad. Take care, Lynn.
Sure thing. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.